The vice presidency is an awkward and unrewarding job. They don't have any power. Nobody dreams about becoming vice president. And for the most part, vice presidents are very, very forgettable. Like, I have no idea who Calvin Coolidge's vice president was. That's why for the most part, vice presidents have been chosen for short-term political reasons rather than asking, hey, if the president died, would this person actually be a good successor? There have been times where this kind of carelessness has backfired massively and has changed the course of American history. We're going to talk about 3 cases that actually are not that widely known, but had a huge impact on American history. Let's start with the first time a president died in office. Few people know or care much about the 1840 presidential election. In fact, even history nerds are like, hey, isn't that the election where we elected that guy who died after a month? In fact, that election changed the course of American history, all because the wrong vice president was chosen. For the preceding 15 years, American politics had been dominated by Andrew Jackson's Democratic Party. It was a populist party. Its voting base was primarily unskilled workers and poor farmers. Since that was most people in America at the time, it was a formidable political coalition. The opposition party was called the Whigs. They were unified by their hatred of Andrew Jackson, but most of them believed in something called the American system. The American system called for a national bank to stabilize the economy, high tariffs to raise revenue and protect American manufacturing, and a national infrastructure program to connect the country. The 1840 presidential election seemed to be the first time that the Whigs had a real chance of winning. The economy was going through a depression, and Democratic President Martin Van Buren was unpopular. The Whigs nominated for president a popular war hero named William Henry Harrison, a man who was best known for winning the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811. A prominent politician from Virginia named John Tyler was chosen to be vice president. It didn't seem like a lot of thought was put into this pick beyond the fact that Tyler represented a big swing state. The ticket of Tippecanoe and Tyler too won a decisive victory, although it should be noted that Tyler did not deliver Virginia to the Whigs. The Whigs even won control of the House and Senate, which gave them the opportunity to implement their agenda. A little over a month into his presidency, William Henry Harrison took a walk on a cold, rainy day. He wasn't wearing a coat and he wasn't wearing a hat. He soon developed a severe chill. His personal doctor applied the best medical practices of the day: bloodletting, opium, wine, and brandy. Shockingly, these didn't work, and he died a few days later. Thus, John Tyler became the first vice president to ascend to the presidency, and boy did the Whigs regret their decision, because it turns out John Tyler opposed everything they stood for. When Congress passed a bill establishing a national bank, Tyler vetoed it. When they passed another bill establishing a national bank, Tyler vetoed that too. Congress passed 2 bills raising tariffs, Tyler vetoed both of them. They didn't even bother trying to pass a national infrastructure program. John Tyler basically blocked the entire Whig agenda. Whig leaders taunted him as his excellency and kicked him out of the party. They even opened up impeachment proceedings against him. The Whigs lost their congressional majorities in the midterms, and a Democratic president was elected in 1844. The Whigs would never get a shot to implement their agenda. Now, all this talk about tariffs and a national bank might sound like mundane and boring stuff, but I promise you it was actually really important. I would argue that the failure of the Whigs to implement their agenda, along with the annexation of Texas, something that John Tyler did despite Whig opposition, is what made the American Civil War inevitable. I'll flesh that out more in a future video, but needless to say, the selection of John Tyler as vice president had enormous implications. By the way, John Tyler would return to politics later in life as a congressman for the Confederate States of America. On a more fun note, John Tyler actually has a living grandson as of the time of this recording, 161 years after his death. John Tyler was not the only vice president picked to backfire massively. In 1864, Abraham Lincoln was up for re-election. The Civil War was raging, and it was not going great for the Union. Lincoln was worried that he would lose the election, so he decided to drop his young, healthy, loyal Republican vice president and replace him with someone else. Lincoln chose a Democrat from Tennessee named Andrew Johnson to be his vice president. Johnson had been the only Southern senator to stay loyal to the United States, and he had been an avid supporter of the Union war effort. By choosing Johnson, Lincoln hoped to show his seriousness about repairing the Union. And who knows, it may have actually helped him win the election. The problem was that Andrew Johnson was not the kind of guy that you wanted to be president, especially at this time. Johnson had a serious drinking problem, a drinking problem that was so severe that he got drunk the night before his inauguration. He woke up with a big hangover, took a couple shots of whiskey to settle himself, and then gave this long, rambling, incoherent speech in front of President Lincoln and the rest of the American government. More important, Johnson was not a Republican, and he did not support the Republican agenda. Johnson had come to support the abolition of slavery, and he did take that position before it was politically safe to do so, so he does deserve some credit for that. But that's as far as Johnson was willing to go. He ideally wanted all the free slaves to go back to Africa, but if they had to stay in America, then he did not believe in granting them citizenship and granting them civil rights. None of this would have mattered if Andrew Johnson had just been a forgettable vice president, but as you know, Abraham Lincoln was shot shortly after the beginning of his second term, making Johnson the president just as the Civil War was coming to an end. Johnson's belief was that the southern states had never actually left the United States, and therefore once they established loyal governments, they should be allowed right back in with very few conditions. They would have to free the slaves, of course, but beyond that, they could really do whatever they wanted. They freed the slaves, but then they imposed regulations that forced the freedmen to work against their will, limited their ability to own property, and limited their ability to move. If a freedman was considered a vagrant, which was left deliberately vague, then they could actually be put back into forced labor. It sure seemed like things hadn't actually changed. Johnson was fine with this, but Northern public opinion was outraged. They weren't necessarily bothered by the racism of it all, but they were bothered by the fact that it seemed to be a slap in the face to all the sacrifices that Union soldiers had made. This pushed Congress to act. Congress passed a law funding a federal agency to help free slaves. Johnson vetoed it. He thought it would make the freedmen lazy and dependent on the government. Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Which granted citizenship to all Americans and protected their basic civil rights. Johnson vetoed that, saying that it was a form of reverse discrimination against white people. This was too much for the moderates in Congress, who unified with the radical Republicans to override a presidential veto for the first time in American history. This kicked off a series of moves and countermoves between Congress and the president over control of Reconstruction, especially over the fate of the former slaves. While some protection and support for the freedmen did pass, Johnson's actions emboldened the former ruling class of the South to resist fundamental changes to Southern society. It would take 10 more years, but eventually they would be back in charge. As for Andrew Johnson, he frustrated Congress so much that they impeached him under pretty flimsy pretexts. Nevertheless, when his case came before the Senate, he came just one vote short of being removed from office. So as good of a president as Abraham Lincoln was, and he was phenomenal, his choice of Andrew Johnson as vice president is a black stain on his legacy. Let's talk about one more case of a vice presidential pick backfiring, and this one's actually kind of funny. Theodore Roosevelt was a hero of the Spanish-American War who was elected as governor of New York in 1899. Roosevelt was a quirky guy who had strong progressive views. Now, at the time, the Republican Party was divided between conservatives and progressives, and the conservative wing of the Republican Party hated Roosevelt. So when William McKinley's vice president died in 1899, the New York Republican Party conspired to make Teddy Roosevelt the replacement so that he would be trapped in a powerless office. Despite Teddy Roosevelt's less than enthusiastic support, he was put on the ticket, and they defeated William Jennings Bryan in the 1900 presidential election. Now, this plot to trap Roosevelt in a powerless office backfired in 1901 when William McKinley was assassinated by an anarchist. Theodore Roosevelt then became the most powerful man in America, and he used that position to push a progressive agenda. He attacked monopolies. He pushed through new regulations on railroads, drugs, and food. Basically, he did far more than he would have been able to do as the governor of New York. So there you have it, 3 vice president picks that backfired. Not every vice president pick has turned out to be a disaster, but as you can see, some have, and have had a profound impact on American history as a result. So if you are ever considering who to nominate for vice president, make sure you pick carefully. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a like. It helps the channel so much. Thank you for watching. Bye for now.